Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ian Anderson. Today we're going to be talking about PPD-21 and kind of what it looks like 8 years later, specifically from the perspective of the operator slash user slash guy down here in the trenches just trying to make things a little bit better every single day. So my name is Ian Anderson. I'm a manager of enterprise security at Oklahoma Gas and Electric. OG&E, we are spread across from the west end of the state to the east end, and all throughout Oklahoma, and even into parts of Arkansas. So we are the largest electric utility for the people here in Oklahoma. Specifically, my responsibility is for security operations on both cyber and physical, and we leverage something called the integrated security platform, meaning my operators do everything from IT to OT to cloud, everything in the field, everything's physical. We carry all those responsibilities all within a single team. The obligatory agenda for today's conversation is we're going to do a quick PPD-21 review. We're going to talk a little bit about what it looks like from the trenches. In doing so, I think we're going to expose some opportunities to improve, and then hopefully come up with some potential ways that we can close those gaps. If you're, my hope is you're going to walk out of this presentation with a little bit more perspective of how frontline asset owners are or can use things like PPD-21, NIP, the sector specific plans, and the things like that that have been put out over the past 15 years, or I guess it's really like 24 years at this point, related to federal cybersecurity policy and presidential directives. I also want to ensure that we cover this. I'm very aware that not all of these problems, not all the problems related to the critical infrastructure sectors are all cyber related. But for the sake of this presentation, we're really only going to focus on the cyber element. Physical element is critical too, and it needs a lot of attention. But the next few slides, we're only going to focus on the cyber piece. So moving forward. So PPD-21, 8 years later, I think do a little bit of pocket math, and we can trace it back to 2013 when PPD-21 and the executive order that went along with it was originally published. But really, PPD-21 started in 1998 with PDD, or Presidential Decision Directive 63 from the Clinton administration. That was really one of the first to kind of say, hey, we've got this growing vulnerability related to critical infrastructure, and it is the president's intent to swiftly eliminate any significant vulnerability to both physical and cyber. And this was very clear to call out especially cyber systems. So going all the way back to 1998, when the majority of the technology that is currently driving your industrial control systems was originally deployed, the president of the United States, federal government, was saying, hey, the United States has a unique dependency here, and it does represent this kind of critical vulnerability that needs to be properly managed. Now, flash forward 5 years. The world looks very different after 9/11, and so HSPD 7, or Homeland Security Presidential Directive 7, came out, and it had a much more terrorism-focused perspective on it, or at least that's how folks like me, normal folks, interpreted it. What's interesting though is that this is one of the first ones that I've seen where you see the phrase sector-specific agency, or SSA, start to get used in the kind of the common discussion. And that's important because 10 years later with PPD-21, sector-specific agencies really took the center spotlight, as they were really the interconnect between the asset operators and the federal intent to protect these cyber systems. So PPD-21 came out. It had some very clear directives for the NIPP, or the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, moving on to the sector-specific plans, and then on forward to where we're at today. So to recap PPD-21, I think it's most famous for the establishment of the critical infrastructure sectors, and it's the 16 sectors you see here on the left side of the slide. The PPD-21 set the roles and responsibilities, and namely, that's the roles and responsibilities of the federal government. It kind of stopped short of saying where private sector, where public sector, where these folks kind of intermingled. And I think it's really the intent was to allow the SSAs to drive that. There were specific items around strategic imperatives, and we'll cover those here in in a later slide. But this is a major call out of PPD-21, or these 3 strategic imperatives. There was also they wanted to make sure that they called out the need for research and development, and this is really where this kind of public-private partnership begins to occur, and around the development of tools and security capabilities that are going to help protect critical infrastructure. And as we'll see in literally the next slide, it does present somewhat of a tension with defenders. So now, I read PPD-21, and a lot of it still feels like, hey, individual asset owners, the intent with PPD-21 was to give you some information, but still at the end of the day, you are kind of on your own. So may the odds be ever in your favor, to steal a line from the Hunger Games. So now, before, we're going to go through roles and responsibilities, strategic imperatives, but let's just take a quick layover with research and development. And I'd like to present this slide because nothing to me captures the insanity that is cybersecurity like showing this graphic. So this is an alleged graphic of all the different cybersecurity vendors that are out there. And I think this is just the ones large enough to have their logo somewhere out there on the internet for an intern to grab and put it to this image. Like, we see far more startups. There's a bunch of different groups in silent mode, or just they haven't received the the amount of press that they really should. And so this is a major collection of different capabilities, different pieces of software, and decision points that asset owners like myself have to go through to think about, figure out how I'm going to fit these pieces together. Now, speaking of R&D and PPD-21, one of the most exciting things is we now have an ICS OT section, and this section has been growing. And so it used to be, this is such a niche area that no one does this specifically. And now we've got, well over a dozen, approaching 24 different companies that seem to only focus on not IoT, but industrial control systems and operational technology. Huge difference, huge growth. So the R&D piece of PPD-21, if we just use the private sector as a measure of capabilities that are growing, then PPD, whether or not it had a direct impact, clearly it said that this R&D is needed in order to secure our critical infrastructure, and we are seeing that today. Now, we did talk, it does bring up a problem, though, of the tension around the private sector. So private sector does research and development. They are expecting a return on their investment, and a lot of the critical infrastructure owners don't necessarily have a whole lot of resources to spend in order to buy and bring on these tools. And again, we'll get to that here in just a little bit. Now, moving forward to the PPD-21 strategic imperatives, right? So there are 3. Refine and clarify functional relationships, enable the efficient information exchange, and implement an integration and analysis function. So item 1 is strictly around NCCIC and the NICC, right? And those are 2 agencies or groups that existed before PPD-21, but this is kind of a doubling down of the importance that the cyber and physical information centers play in the integration and analysis of information. The second strategic imperative is really just about information sharing, right? So threat intelligence, timely threat and vulnerability data. There's a specific call out to development of situational awareness. I think it has taken us 8 years to start to get better at this, and we'll see some examples here in a little bit of how that has occurred, but the timeliness anymore is of the most critical importance. So, and then lastly is the implement an integration and analysis function. I think we are all belonging to ISACs or familiar with ISACs and kind of what their role is. We are now seeing instances where we are members of multiple ISACs, and so how do you handle competing information, competing attention needs from the different ISACs. Now, so refining and clarifying the functional relationships, here's the ultimate problem, right? So if we start very high up with NIPP, and then the protection plan, and we look at the sector-specific agency and then their sector-specific plan, it is still so high level and abstract that it's really hard for the asset owners, for the people down in the trenches to interpolate, what am I supposed to do? What is my actual guidance? How can I make things better just overall, right? At least from these presidential directives. So what is the expectation for asset owners? The federal government is very clear about how it expects agencies to interact with each other at a very high level, but it's not very clear about what is expected from the different asset owners who are ultimately responsible for implementing and managing the security of the critical infrastructure itself. And probably more importantly, what actually constitutes success here? How do we know that we're doing better? Are we seeing less vulnerabilities? Are we seeing less exploitations? I mean, if that's the case, how does Oldsmar fit into this? How does SolarWinds fit into this? Are we getting better at detection, or are we failing in prevention? Where are we heading in that regard? And so if we take the NIPP and the sector specific plan and apply it to a different industry. So I'm going to choose something outside of electricity. I'm going to go with water, because I think water is a fascinating group to an area for discussion. So water's SSP, which mind you was published in 2015, it listed the #1 priority as being the advancement of the development of sector-specific cybersecurity resources. So the SSP called out directly the need to continue to grow and develop cybersecurity specific resources. Now in that same document, it gives us kind of a rough estimation of the different organizations and their sizes in relation to water systems. So if priority 1 is the advancement and the development of sector-specific cybersecurity resources, only 410 of those water systems serve populations greater than 100,000. There are tens of thousands of water systems that fall below the very large. And the reason we're going to key in on the very large is the likeliest set of asset owners to be able to have the resources to apply the cybersecurity skills and resources needed to meet priority 1. Now in 2015, we say, what are the near-term goals? And SSP, I think it even said like near-term is within 2 years. So guiding practices and tools, guidance practices and tools. So there's some risk management, there's some risk assessment stuff, there's some tools that help you integrate best practices or help you judge your program against best practices. Enhancing resources, I think is certainly an area that I don't feel like we've hit it. And the reason is that we don't see the smaller water systems or smaller asset owners being able to do things like find the tools that pay for the tools that allow them to be able to do things with the information that's provided by the ISACs or by the intelligence community or wherever it's coming from. We also have the smaller asset owners a real problem with resources from a people perspective, where you have a single person who is responsible for a whole plethora of different activities within the organization and isn't just strictly focused on security. But that is even changing. With the American Water Infrastructure Act of 2018, we saw risk assessments become a mandate. And so the presidential directives are great to signal like, this is where we want to be, this is who we want to be. But at the end of the day, it still requires legislation in order to force or set a minimum expectation for what our asset owners are doing. So with the American Water Infrastructure Act, all water utilities above the size of 3,301 are expected to perform a risk assessment. And there's a whole lot of really great, interesting detail, but that you can go read online. But the insight is this: is that we cannot accurately apply cybersecurity capabilities unless we understand the risks that are involved with these specific water systems. And so while it doesn't get us to half of the size of the water systems, we are getting by far the vast majority of the water systems that serve Americans. So, all right, moving on to enabling efficient information exchange. Shout out to Rob Lee and Jeff Haas for this one. I will never forget this day. There's a notification that got sent out to some of us, and it talked about a TLP Red briefing. It was like almost Christmas time, if I remember right. And basically the whole thing was a big old, let's bring everyone in together to watch us give each other pats on the back. And I'm all for celebrating victories, but this was one of those instances where it really felt like we missed as an industry, because we were more worried about congratulating each other than we really were about addressing and talking about some of the problems that were going on. Attribution's great. I couldn't agree more, but we have to be careful with like the way that we use our TLP, our traffic light protocols, and not use red or amber, you know, in instances where it shouldn't happen, right? So I will say that things have gotten so much better on this front, and information exchange today is really great, at least in my opinion, right? So SolarWinds, I think, you know, as terrible as the vulnerability and the exploitation and the compromise has been, SolarWinds by itself has actually been fantastic from a response perspective. And so to just touch on that one, you know, CISA actually put out a, you know, a webinar, allowed people to come in, showed everything that they knew, and then produced IOCs. And in the most mind-blowing event ever, they took questions. They just had open mic, who has questions about what's going on. I've never once seen that before, especially from a federal agency. And it was so relieving because it allowed the information exchange to actually be two-way rather than one-way. And once we started getting into a two-way communication exchange, we started really being able to touch on a wonderful relationship between asset owners and federal government and all the resources that the federal government has that can bring to bear. ISACs and fusion centers, I think, continue to develop and grow and mold, you know, with the times and figure out what works where. And the term ISAC itself has really become synonymous with success. I know probably some people are probably rolling their eyes, but you know, we are seeing more and more people refer to groups as ISACs, right? So the state of Oklahoma recently formed their own ISAC. And so it's not necessarily, it's very much a geographical way to bring us all together, because you know, we share kind of similar problems, similar concerns when you start talking about geographies and scales and the kinds of, you know, people that a lot of us serve. You know, it makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways. And so the ISAC, you know, term was used by Oklahoma Cyber Command because they view it as a success, or as at least a way to logically connect one effort to another. So, and then we're seeing flesh out of those ISACs is we're kind of coming back to the public-private partnership. So the Oklahoma ISAC has actually partnered with Anomaly. And so now there is an OK ISAC vulnerability management that is specifically for the OK ISAC. Now this is awesome, but the public-private partnership, again, introduces this tension, because the service that the OK ISAC provides is free, but in order to really get it to do something that you really want it to be able to do, it's going to cost you some money. And that creates a problem. So let's talk about the resources. Now, the reason I'm most concerned about just SolarWinds in general is that there's a reason why other entities and organizations that I've been a part of personally, we've gone with SolarWinds. And frankly, it was about cost. You know, SolarWinds is a very affordable product. SolarWinds has a very robust purchasing policy, meaning most government institutions have contracts and stuff like that in place in order to buy SolarWinds because they are so ubiquitous. And so SolarWinds is kind of like what you can buy when you just need to be able to get something done on kind of a basic level, but don't have enough money for a thing like a Splunk or something like that. So now what SolarWinds, what's happened is SolarWinds has really kind of created this instance where you enter into a realm where you have the haves versus the have-nots. And PPD-21 has kind of helped continue that along by saying, the focus here is on research and development and developing these capabilities within the private sector. And then it's like, well, if the market has all these tools, then, in general, all the critical infrastructure will be able to keep up. Well, that's not necessarily the case. So the haves, right? If we start thinking about what large, typically private, but even large municipalities, the capitals of most cities and things like that, they're going to have, typically dedicated personnel and or teams and or multiple teams, right? They're going to have that security operations and security engineering and application security, network security, threat intelligence, things like that. But when you're talking about a municipality of roughly 75,000 people, you're going to have two people only for IT. And security is part of IT. I think that's very, very common. So the haves have funding resources for best-in-class tools. I feel like every time I say the word Splunk, I'm going to owe someone a whole bunch of money, right? Because these tools are like, they're fantastic, but there's no way for smaller entities to be able to afford them. So, and well-financed programs have this capability to do this kind of continuous improvement. We're really not building, it's not tools, it's programs. And these programs don't really have an end state. Whereas with the smaller organizations, it's really more about these kind of sprints to get up to a level, and then you wait for the next funding round to come around, which is 2, 3, 4 years, then you do it again. And so you're doing jumps rather than this kind of continuous improvement. So if we contrast that to the haves with the have-nots, as I like to call them, like I said, we're performing these in a series of sprints. The supply chain typically isn't as robust, and that's really due to a contractual law, or just like municipal law, which is where a lot of the water, and some other critical infrastructure is located. They can't just go out and buy whatever they want. They have to have some contract, right? And there are instances where you've seen a bunch of different vendors kind of collect together to form a big, large contract that then can be signed, have the state legislation, signed to it, and then the municipality can leverage the state's relationship. It just becomes a big mess, right? In order to simply buy the tools. So some tool decisions are made based upon the easiest route to purchase. So I'd be a fool for not mentioning OpEx versus CapEx challenges. So a lot of municipalities, a lot of utilities, especially anyone that's kind of regulated, is going to be least likely to be able to absorb operational OpEx expenditures, and they're going to be far more CapEx focused. The problem is the entire world is going to this subscription, pay monthly per user. I mean, look at what Microsoft is doing with M365. That effectively prices out a whole lot of different organizations because they simply cannot, from a financial perspective, make it work, right? They may even have the money, but it's tied up in CapEx. They can't use it for operational expenses. And then lastly, the have-nots, it's just hard to operationalize things like IOCs, hashes, all this threat intelligence that you get, unless you have a threat intelligence platform that can integrate that information, tie into your SIM, if you even have a SIM, things like that. A lot of these smaller municipalities and utilities just don't have those resources. And so what we're saying is, hey, we've got a whole bunch of money that we're going to toss at, or we got a whole bunch of resources or information that we're going to toss at you, but you don't have the money or the resources to ingest it and actually do something good with it. So how do we overcome this, right? So I think standards and resources are one of the most important things that we should drive towards as an industry and as leadership. So standards help because they set a minimum standard, and the standard helps because then you can leverage that standard when trying to request additional resources. I also think that we should have some sort of state, local SLTT purchasing power capability. With scale comes better prices. And so if we can figure out a way to allow, municipalities or sectors or someone to kind of band together and drive towards a common solution and be able to greatly reduce that cost, that's something that could potentially really move the needle. I think we have some great resources with the National Guard. I think that we have a lot of cyber units that are getting stood up, both in the Air National Guard and the Army Guard. What I would say is, I don't know, I'm not the big strategist, right? But if I'm looking at those units and say, hey, if we can give them a kind of a defensive perspective, that is something that then they could leverage those skills to help out the smaller municipalities. Think a National Guard unit goes in, for their AT, takes a look at Oldsmar, helps them remediate, some of the issues that occurred there. Could be useful. Looking at GAAP and trying to figure out how these subscriptions fit with like capital expenditures, operational expenditures. A lot of utilities are going to be very, very slow to adopt new GAAP measures unless there's very clear legislative language that says that they can do so. And then also, I think it's worth taking a look at grants, scholarships, training credits, funding to protect federal buildings, military installations. There's all these requirements that's being made of critical infrastructure, and I think that we can use, the relationship of the critical infrastructure to government itself as a mechanism to help build the capability of the entire organization. So, in wrapping up, I will say I do believe PPD-21 has been successful. It has created a language and it has created an opportunity for discussion that is driving us forward. It's probably not going as fast as some of us would like, but that's the United States. It's sometimes very slow to methodically move from one condition to another. We talked about some gaps. A gap is connecting strategy to action, and then also the resource gap. And opportunities, purchasing opportunities, talent opportunities, these are all just different resources that go into the overall capability of an organization to defend itself. So PPD-21 laid all the groundwork. And so now the next step is to tie resources or some sort of standard to our critical infrastructure sectors in order to say, this is the minimum level that we need you to be at. And in order to get that, if you need some resources, here's some mechanisms that you can use that could logically give them the resources needed to go execute. So with that, that really wraps it up. Are there any questions?